Thank you so much, and what a perfect setup for another session of interactive dialogue. So this is a working session. So if you're here to do your email, have a snooze, keep the rain off, you might not be in the right place. This is a working session on a critical issue, which we're calling the Social Progress Challenge. What is the Social Progress Challenge? The challenge is that our world is working on a broken model. Economic growth has delivered enormous benefits for humanity over the last 50 years in particular. But we know there's a problem. Despite economic growth, we can see in this country how millions of Americans are living lives of frustration and desperation reflected in the politics that we're seeing. In my country, in the United Kingdom, the economy is growing, unemployment's at the lowest levels historically, but still we're seeing social indicators are flatlining, people are frustrated. The same story is true across the rest of Europe. It's true across China, across India, across South Africa, across Mexico. We've got a problem, which is that we've got a world oriented towards progress based solely around economic growth. But we know that economic growth is not delivering for people. It's the challenge of what people often talk about as inclusive growth. And don't take my word for it. Take the word of the chairman of our advisory board, Michael Porter of Harvard Business School. Michael Porter is the world's leading guru on economic competitiveness. He is a business professor. He's an expert on strategy. He's a red-blooded capitalist. He is a registered Republican. But he still thinks that our model for economic growth alone is not enough. And we've got to figure out ways to turn our wealth into real well-being more effectively. And the Social Progress Index, which my organization is working on, is an effort to address that challenge. The Social Progress Index has been designed not as a replacement for GDP and measures of economic growth, but as a complement. It's designed to sit alongside and to look at the real things that matter to real people. You'll see here the model we've used for the Social Progress Index. It's asking fundamentally three questions about a society. First of all, does everyone have the basic needs of survival? Food, water, shelter, safety. Secondly, does everyone have those building blocks of a better life? Education, information, health, and a good quality environment? And finally, does every individual have the opportunity to pursue their hopes and dreams with rights, with freedom of choice, freedom from discrimination, and access to the world's most advanced knowledge? This is our independent measure of whether we're living in a good society. Fundamentally, it's got four design principles. The first, really important to note, is it's got no economic indicators. Not because we think the economy doesn't matter, but because if we can create a measure of social progress independent of economic measures, we can then look at the relationship between the two to understand what is this thing, inclusive growth. Secondly, we've based the index on indicators that are all about outcomes. We take all the data from the UN and other trusted sources. It's all secondary data. And then we bring together a whole range of indicators to measure outcomes. So we're not measuring how much a country spends on healthcare. We're measuring the health outcomes they achieve. We're not measuring whether countries pass laws against discrimination. We're measuring whether people experience discrimination. So that way we try to strip out value judgments about which are the right policies and get beyond some of the politics. Thirdly, we've made it relevant to all countries. Too much of our measurement in the world has sort of two lenses, one for the rich world, one for the poor world. When actually countries are increasingly facing common challenges. So we've created a measure that can be relevant across all countries. And critically fourth, we've created something that's actionable, because we're not here in the index building business just for the fun of it. We're in this business because we really want to change the world. Critically, and I was really pleased when I arrived at my registration on the first day to be invited to take a pin for Tech for the SDGs. And certainly for us, the Social Progress Index is a tool that is aligned with Sustainable Development Goals and is a tool that's seeking to support the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals. So what we've been doing is we've been able to measure about 128 countries in the world on their social progress. And we can put them all together, create an aggregate score out of 100, and rank the countries in how they perform. We've been doing it for a few years now, and here is the 2017 ranking. Now, you'll see at the top we have Denmark, and at the bottom we have Central African Republic. I'd like to say this is reassuringly boring. If we had Central African Republic at the top and Denmark at the bottom, we would be doing something wrong. So we can then go down and see how we go from Denmark and go through the rankings and seeing how different countries perform. Now, this is one way of looking at the data, but I want to show a different way of looking at the data, which is not just looking at their absolute performance, but looking at how countries perform compared to their GDP. And that's here. So here's social progress on the vertical axis, higher is better. GDP per capita on the horizontal scale, further to the right is more. And what we see first of all, and for some reason I've lost my regression line on this, but the general pattern is that yes, economic growth is associated with higher social progress. And that's good news. The model we've had is not completely flawed. That's why we've seen economic growth has lifted 1 billion people out of poverty in the last 20 years. Economic growth has real potential to benefit people. It can help us build roads, it can pay for nurses, it can pay for vaccines, it can pay for teachers. So there's lots that economic resources can do to improve our lives. But it's not the whole story. There's plenty of noise around the trend line that you can't see that shows that GDP simply is not destiny. At every level of GDP, there are opportunities for more social progress, risks of less. Some countries are really good at turning their wealth into real well-being for their citizens, some are not. And let me show you now an example of a country that's not so good at turning its wealth into real quality of life for its citizens. I'm sad to say, the United States. So the United States, this is all a bit complicated. So the headline thing is, of our countries, 128 countries, the US is the 5th highest in GDP per capita. But the US is only the 18th in our ranking on social progress. It's in the second tier of performance of social progress, behind European countries, behind Canada, behind Japan. The US is really underperforming on social progress. And what this scorecard does is it compares how the US is performing across this range of indicators against a peer group of countries of similar GDP per capita. So it's just a bit like boxing. We're comparing an economic super heavyweight like the US to other economic super heavyweights. And you can see the countries listed there in the bottom left. And where the US is significantly overperforming relative to that peer group, it gets a green mark, a blue mark. If it's underperforming, a red mark. And as you see, this scorecard's got a lot of red on it. The US is the only major industrial country that consistently underperforms on its social progress relative to GDP per capita. We've seen this consistently since 2014 when we first did this. If we want to see what is ailing people and making people angry in America, it's right here. And it's here in things like safety. It's here in the education system. It's there in healthcare. America spends more than any other country in the world as a percentage of GDP on healthcare and ranks 34th in the world, achieves the same outcomes as Turkey. Environment, even freedom of choice, tolerance, really consistently low scores. And since 2014, this has been flatlining. So we've got a scorecard like this for every country. Some of them are actually good stories, like Costa Rica is a great country at turning its wealth into GDP. Others, not so good, like the US. Now, this is all very interesting, but what's this going to do to actually change what's actually occurring in people's lives? Well, the first one we want to do is really create this rigorous understanding between economic development and social progress, and really demonstrate this point empirically, that if you're basing your society's development on economic growth alone, you've got only half a model. So that's the first thing we want to do, is really nail down that issue. Secondly, it helps us put all the different issues a society faces into a common framework and see where the biggest problems are. And also looking at that both in absolute terms, but relative to other countries of similar wealth. Thirdly, by creating this common measure, it creates a common language that can bring different sectors together around discussing where are the biggest problems, where are the solutions, bringing government, business, and civil society together. And fourthly, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a moment, it doesn't just apply to countries. We can apply it to subnational level as well. So this is why we created the Social Progress Index as a tool to help us change the model for development for our societies. And what we've been doing over the last 4 years is working in a number of countries to do this. We started in Latin America, and what we've been doing there is now spanning a dozen countries. I've just got a few examples here. Maybe I'll start in the middle. Paraguay is a country that's experienced decades of economic growth without social progress. So they were actually the first country in the world to adopt Social Progress Index as an official metric for their country. So they now have a national development plan with two targets, an economic growth target and a social progress target. And that means that social progress is now cascading through their government budget system, setting priorities. And one of the priorities they've set based on this is around eliminating child malnutrition by 2018. And so more money is going into those programs. And so we like to believe that we've played a role in helping ensure that fewer children in Paraguay are going to bed hungry, which is why we're doing this. I mentioned subnational indices. We've done work in Colombia, measuring social progress across 10 different cities, looking at trends of social progress over that period. And in Bogota, we've looked at different districts of the city, and that's now being used by city authorities to set their development plans. We've also collaborated, as you'll see at the bottom, with Coca-Cola and the Brazilian cosmetics company Natura on community social progress indices for specific communities in the Amazon region of Brazil that those companies are interested in for supply chain reasons to help support the development of those specific communities. So we've got a measure that goes from the world, countries, states, cities, districts, even down to community level. The Social Progress Index is flexible at any kind of scale. After Latin America, we then moved on and we started working in Europe. And so the Social Progress Index has now been adopted by the European Commission. And one of their big priorities is what they call cohesion, which is bringing together these disparate countries, some very rich, like your Swedens and Denmarks, some very poor, like Bulgaria or Romania, and trying to bring them together through a whole program of regional investments. This is a program worth more than $100 billion. And they've been using GDP to allocate resources and to decide where the programs are. They have now adopted and are using Social Progress Index to inform those programs and start to bring a new way of thinking about how those monies can be used. And just a couple of months ago, I was in Ireland, where the finance minister holds an annual national economic dialogue, which brings together government, business, civil society, trade unions to talk about the next year's budget priorities. And traditionally, this discussion begins with a presentation of the macroeconomic situation in Ireland. This year, it started with a presentation on the macroeconomic situation and the social progress situation. And by really putting people's real quality of life at the center of the debate, the center of discussion, we're hoping that this can really drive change in how budgetary resources are used. So Europe is one of our big areas that's adopted it now. And then most recently, we're now working in India. So that's 1.2 billion people. And the government of India, Prime Minister Modi's government, has got a big agenda around the transformation of the country. And they're very interested in developing competition between different states in India. So working with his government, we've developed the Social Progress Index for the states of India and are now developing one to go down to the level of cities and districts that will be used for their national planning, for their state planning, and also critically for their monitoring of progress against sustainable development goals. So in a few years, the Social Progress Index has become really widely adopted around the world. And I think one of the critical factors behind it is because it's a complement to economic measures, not a replacement. Wherever I go in the world, leaders know that they need to do something differently. The Social Progress Index is a way for them to do so in a safe way. They don't have to stop doing anything. They can just put the Social Progress Index alongside and then start seeing if that can have an impact. And we're seeing that when you look at the world differently in that way, you start making different choices. So now we've done Latin America, Europe, moving into Asia. We're now thinking of North America and the United States. So this is our next big project, and the one we really want to talk to you today about, is we're developing now at an initial level a 50-state index, and then we want to go down to a more granular level to counties, districts, etc. This is a work which we're building out now. Aim is to launch it in 2018, early 2018, and really build a national debate around this. Now, maybe I'm being a bit too pessimistic here. I'm not expecting the current federal administration to be adopting social progress index, but that doesn't matter, because what we're finding around the world is it doesn't have to be the national government. It can be state governments, city governments, businesses, non-profits who actually can take and use this data. So our customer isn't necessarily the national government in every case. And we think if we can create this granular data for the US, it's got real potential to actually help the agenda that we all care about in this room, we all care about at this conference, to really put social progress on the agenda, put the issues of people's real quality of life at the top of the agenda, and help us make better choices. Now, we've got an exercise coming up, but before I introduce that, any general questions about the index or what we're planning on doing? Patrick. It's a great question, and you know how to hurt me. I wish we could. I mean, I would love to do men and women, different demographic groups, different ethnic groups perhaps. There's a whole range of ways we'd love to cut it differently, and we are still dealing with averages. And I wish we could do it differently. I think we're thinking about ways, if we can use new data, that we could start doing that in a different way. But not yet, but we'd love to, again, something we'd love to brainstorm with people about how we can push that forward. Please. Right. So for the global data set, we take it only from trusted global institutions. So I don't check North Korea's education data. It's only data that comes into the UN or some other trusted institution. When we build a subnational index, we'll use different data sets. So we might use national data sets. And that means we keep that basic structure of those 12 components of the model I showed you on that early slide. That stays the same, but we vary the indicators based on what's available and also to make it relevant in different contexts. Now, that's the way we have to do it. Now, when we did the European index, what we did after we'd finished it, we then added up the European regional scores to make country scores. And to our great delight, we found we came up with pretty much the same result as on our global index. So as long as we're measuring similar indicators for the same concepts, we should get broadly consistent results. But that's the flexibility that allows us to go down to that granular level. Any more? No? Cool. Right, so here is the challenge. We're building this US index, and here, for your eyes only, is our current first rough cut index. We've gone out, we've searched for all the data that we can find on federal databases, grabbing it before it disappears, gone to other places, and produced this set of indicators for these 12 components. This is the best that we've been able to do in the time available. And what we really want is help in ideas on how can we do better? Are there other data sets we can be using? Let me say, we always know that none of our indices is perfect. There are always things we'd love to measure better. And we know for this 50-state index, we won't have a perfect measure, but we want one that's good enough. So your help in finding where there might be data that we could use, especially at the state level, but also as we start to build below the state level, will be critically important. So that's the kind of data challenge. Then the second challenge here is also, once we've got this index, how do we deliver it? How do we make this accessible and meaningful? How do we really have an impact on this data so it punches through into the policy debate, the political debate, gets people excited, gets people wanting to use it, gets people like you wanting to use it? What we love to see is when non-profits are using it for advocacy, when foundations are using it for prioritization. We really want to create a strong group of leaders and customers for this data who can really help push this through. So these are the two challenges on which we would like your help. And to do that, we are going to split you into two groups. So let me say, on this side of the room, we'll do challenge one around the data. This side of the room will do the challenge about the usability of the data. And I am a kind person. So if anyone would like to run around between one side of the room or the other, you have one chance now if you want to switch sides. Data on this side, and then usability on this side. Okay? That's how we're going to split. And then what we're going to do is break into these two groups, and then I have wonderful colleagues assisting me. My colleague Ladan, at the front here, you're going to do group one. Group two, which is here, with Mike from Broad Green Solutions. Thank you, Mike. And then Lauren and I will come over and do group 2 on usability. Group 1 on data. Yes, cool. So what's our timing, Ladan? What's our timing? How long have we got?
On time?
Oh, Lauren, how long have we got?
We've got 45 minutes at least.
We've got 45 minutes at least. Brainstorm ideas, and what we're looking to do is come up with 1 or 2 ideas each group, and then we'll have a report back and share those ideas. All right? All clear? Any questions? Good. Thank you very much. You found one of my pain points. So,
Do you want to repeat, repeat that like in...
So just a question about sort of housing data, and does homelessness measure the whole problem? You know, are there other forms of homelessness, which could be sleeping in cars, couch surfing, which are homelessness but wouldn't get picked up in homelessness data? And I was absolutely busted on the fact that if you look at the US scorecard on our global index, the shelter scores look okay. And that's one of the problems, is the global shelter data absolutely sucks. Because shelter got left out of the Millennium Development Goals. There's been no structured global data collection around housing. And that's why for the global index for housing, I think we're using some basic indicators around indoor air pollution, which is around cook stoves, and then some basic stuff around electrification. And the only indicator we've been able to find that's relevant for more advanced countries is around affordability of housing. So we know that's a weak point in our global index, and we're trying to find better data. And definitely when we get to a national index like this, well, that's why we want to really pull this out and improve on that measurement. But certainly if there are issues in the way we're measuring homelessness, and there are ways we can pick up that wider homelessness challenge, that'd be really valuable. Is there any particular metric that you think that is missing?
I feel like all the people who live in cars and are in hotels and kind of couch surfing or staying with family members are really underrepresented. There's a count, like the one night count that measures homelessness, like on the street, and it's a count of everybody who is sleeping on the street and in shelters, but all those other people are kind of invisible because you can't tell, like if somebody's really sleeping in a car or who in a hotel is doing that. And I don't know how those people are represented in the grand scheme, because it's a huge percentage of the homeless population.
So we should put this in homelessness. I think it's a question getting beyond the one night count. Yeah, so it's getting beyond counting who's actually sleeping on the streets. So there's actually hidden homelessness, and how do we measure that? I don't know exactly what our source of data is on that, but that's definitely one good one for us to check. Any other?
Yeah, in terms of real-time data,
Yeah.
are you utilizing Internet of Things and sensors being put specifically, I know it's very used in medicine, personal safety comes to mind, sensors around cities and stuff like that?
Not yet. Tell me more.
Well, I'm just thinking, just sort of real-time, more data's coming in with the smart city initiatives that are going on. I know we're just placing sensors around cities to collect more data in real time and actually have user-generated, citizen-generated data coming in through smartphones and things like that. I don't know what you're seeing. I'm just curious if you guys have implemented any Internet of Things.
Not yet, but I think it's a great point about that Internet of Things and user-generated data. Is that, I mean, I think, you know, being absolutely frank, what we currently have is a 20th century product. Yeah, we're drawing off official statistics, we're drawing off traditional surveys, and that's the best we can get at the moment. But actually, when we start harnessing the power of new data, we'll be able to measure these things more accurately, with demographic breakdowns, like Patrick was asking, in much more real time. And that's a real opportunity for us. And that's one of the things where we see a link with Sustainable Development Goals, is the UN's got this absolutely creaking system of measurement. I mean, they currently, for Sustainable Development Goals, they're saying a third of the issues they have indicators they can measure. A third of the issues they have indicators they can measure in theory, but not in practice. And a third of the issues they don't know how to measure. Yeah? So if these goals are actually going to be implemented, we're going to need a kind of measurement revolution, and it's not going to be led by the UN. I think it's going to be led by this new data agenda. So we're really interested in this, and this is why we're thinking, could we create almost 2 indices? One using the 20th century data, and another one on top using 21st century. But we don't know about this stuff, and that's why we're here. So thoughts welcome.
Maybe this goes into the no like stability of the economics. You know, a life-changing event happens and you have no like safety net or
Yeah.
even economic one. Does that fall under your sort of economic side? You know, like access to banking or access to saving or things like that.
Yeah.
Like almost like access to financial services.
Yeah.
Kind of?
Yeah.
Yeah, which I know it's kind of on the border of the.
Yeah, we fight about that quite a lot.
I'll just put it here to remind
But
you.
put it in there. So some of my board groups. So we're now talking to there's a MasterCard Centre for Inclusive Growth. We've done a lot of work in this area. So what we're trying to do is get a measure of financial inclusion that we can then set against this. Because again, if we can demonstrate that financial inclusion is associated with higher social progress, that's a real validator for this as being one of the levers that we can pull in trying to improve that. And especially if we think exactly that point about catastrophic risk and how to insure people against that, $400 cost that Patrick was talking about that throws them off. That's something we could really if we can stand that up, that'll be powerful.
What about political stability, right? I mean, we know invariably political indicators, they're like frequency of civil unrest or free and fair elections or preservation of individual liberties or rights. Like, doesn't have to play a certain, that has to be a part of that nexus with social progress, right? So
Yeah.
feeling like you have political stability and you're not always at risk for that kind of unrest.
So we've got some of that in the rights section. I'm not quite sure what dubious democracy is. That's an indicator we've taken from somewhere. But there's some measure of dubious democracy and also that perceptions of electoral integrity. And part of that is we're thinking of that as being a good in its own right. The living in a society that runs itself properly in that way is actually part of being a good society. But then if we could see how's that associated with other things, would be kind of interesting.
Moral integrity is the most important thing. I mean, it may be that in North Korea, the thought is that the elections are very, very honest. And
Right.
fair,
Yeah.
But is there not a better, more objective metric that you could use that perceived moral integrity?
Well, sometimes perception may matter. And then one of the reasons we always say that the results are robust at the level of each individual component rather than the indicator. Because any individual indicator can be noisy or can have some weird effects like that where North Korea sort of outlies. But by bundling a set of indicators together that we've selected using principal component analysis, we can get a nested set of indicators that behave themselves. And if perceptions of electoral integrity was misbehaving, we'd kick it out of the model. Please.
I'm just curious, how do you measure daily satisfaction? And along with that, have you thought of anything that could roll all this up in terms of using positive psychology, happiness research to kind of get an aggregate score of how contented people are?
Yeah. So we say this is a complementary strand to happiness research, because conceptually you could live in a good unhappy society or a bad happy society. Yeah, I mean, imagine society where there were 99% of us doing well by persecuting 1% of the population terribly. As an average happiness rating, we could be doing really well, but we would be a wicked society. So they're not necessarily the same thing being a good society and a happy society. What we can then do by measuring them separately is look at the relationship. Now, what we find is that in general, good societies tend to be happy. What we also find, however, is that this opportunity dimension has a very important effect on happiness independent of GDP and other factors, which is kind of interesting because the countries that tend to do badly on this are countries like those that were part of the Arab Spring. So those countries tend to be pretty good on the kind of basic human needs and pretty bad on the opportunity bit, which is then saying, well, actually, if you're a dictator trying to, deal with your public, if you don't give them this, there's actually a risk here. And I think that's actually quite important. And I think one thing we've done with this model, and again, we can do because we're not part of the UN, is make these kind of issues a fundamental integral to the model and really sort of highlight the importance of them. So again, that relationship between sort of social progress and happiness is a kind of ongoing research topic.
How do you look at daily satisfaction?
Which one's that?
The last one, personal freedom and choice.
Yeah, I'm not. It's maybe a Gallup survey question. Yeah.
I'm curious how you and your team went about kind of picking the important, I guess maybe in this case demographic
Yeah.
in terms of the personal rights, it seems like it's women and gender, right? It talks about female elected representation, and then when you get to the bottom one, the access to advanced education, it talks about racial diversity in universities and why that instead of gender diversity in universities and racial elected representation. That kind of idea is spread throughout. So, you know, and how do you know where to stop? Like, why aren't we looking at socioeconomic diversity or sexual identity, whatever it might be? How did you guys go about choosing?
My guess is it's based on where we could find data. But I think there's a very good question of have we been consistent in trying to pick that up? With a global index, with this index, we'd love to be able to pick up more of those issues. Because again, I think that equity issue across each of these issues is really, really important. But often it's constrained by what data is available. Actually interesting, we haven't got a gender indicator in access to basic knowledge. But on the global index, we look at gender access to secondary education. And this is an area where a lot of the Scandinavian countries really fall down. And some of the Scandinavian countries in terms of gender equity are doing badly as some countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But the issue is boys dropping out of school. Scandinavia has a huge problem with boys failing in school. So I think trying to pick up that gender lens, I think we haven't got that gender lens under access to basic knowledge, which would be interesting. I think the US tends to do better on that gender equity in basic education. But I think it's a good test and challenge. We should be consistent about that. Please.
I think 2 points. One was I was trying to figure out somewhere to introduce sort of the infrastructure in terms of access to public transportation or access to getting to the job, things like that, around how far people live from their community. So sort of adding something around the transportation aspect or infrastructure perspective.
Yeah.
There's probably third-party data around ways and things like that that could probably also see around transportation.
Yeah, definitely we've done that in some other models, and I think we've probably struggled with the data, but it's a good reminder. Because I think that ability to live your life and get around is so important. It's a fundamental in how we actually measure that. So that's a really good reminder that maybe we've looked and haven't found it. So again, any thoughts on where we could find that?
The other thing I was going to add is, what's interesting, I don't know if you had it in the previous slides, is you look at all these indices, but then how much money is actually being spent to address this? I don't know if there's a way, I know you talked about the GDP, but in terms of when you look at adult obesity, how much money collectively is being actually spent to address that? And that's probably at the state level, federal level, to be able to also use that overlay on top of some of these indices to say, this is what we're rating it, we're spending X to actually try to address it and seeing how that compares to how much money other countries spend. So I think that data may not be available, but I think at the US level, that data probably is available.
Yeah, so that's what we've done. We've focused a lot on generating this outcome measure, but hopefully then that is seeding further research on what's driving the inputs. And exactly that kind of analysis we'd love to do about, well, where's the money being spent? And what's the relationship between the two? I mean, especially I think about that. I mean, just the US health outcomes compared to health spending is just a really striking example, but there are plenty of others where we could look. And I think we are seeing that some of our partners in city governments, etc., are using this in this way, saying, well, how's our budget actually allocating to these different areas? How are we spending money? Are we prioritizing correctly? So that's one of the ways we think we could use the tool.
I had some thoughts.
Please.
Specifically regarding the public infrastructure indicator and the distance from transportation. There are geospatial data sets that can be very applicable here, and also I was thinking about that for health and wellness. Like, there's a thing called OpenStreetMap, which is an open source app that can contribute. It's like kind of like an alternative to Google Maps in some ways. I'm on the open data team here, and we host that data set.
Okay.
People are using that data set to do stuff like identify the distance that the average population lives from a hospital or something like that.
Ah, okay.
And all that kind of information is in there, so you could potentially mine that data set to identify distance to health centers or to places of employment. Mix that with census data to understand the distance that people live from place to place.
That's great.
I'd also say too, when it comes to environmental quality, there's a data set that we host from the EPA that you might already be using, the risk screening environments indicators, which is anytime the EPA gets reports about chemical release or transfer. So this would be maybe in the air pollution or pesticide exposure data set.
Yeah.
This is good for all 50 states.
Oh.
So it's up the last update in 2014. So that's a worthwhile data set.
Yeah.
Another one too is I don't know if you're using satellite imagery in anything that you're doing right now.
Thinking about it, so
That would be an interesting way to measure things like it's very easy to measure like forestation and deforestation with satellite imagery. So it might be a quality of life indicator to understand like how much, especially over time, you know,
yeah.
how the foliage has changed.
Because someone said to me, who's in the financial sector, like hedge funds are using satellite data to count cars in car parks to predict Walmart's quarterly earning figures. Then surely we can find ways to do that to measure social progress. If we had the resources of a hedge fund, maybe we could. But you know,
Yeah, well, I mean, sounds like a sales plug, but we host a petabyte of satellite imagery that can be used to measure forest foliage and forestation. It's updated constantly. It's Landsat 8. That's for the whole world.
it's updated constantly.
Yeah, and there's another satellite that we also host data for, Sentinel-2, from the European Space Agency. It's very similar, and it's updated it takes visits every location on the Earth every 10 days. And Landsat does every 16 days.
Huh. Because we were looking at deforestation in the Amazon doing satellite data, and there was some problem with it, that it was somehow slow to update or something, but maybe that's moved on.
Well, I mean, it used to be that to get a Landsat scene would take you, in best case scenario, some amount of hours. You know, but we should talk maybe about
Okay.
that. You know, we have a lot of people that are using that type of satellite imagery, this visual spectrum satellite imagery, to do stuff like understand forestation, water quality, water levels, like all kinds of.
Okay.
Well, in addition to on the open data, and I wonder, it's kind of a stretch, but looking at like weather data, I mean, from the perspective of large-scale disaster-based events and how that affects people's quality of life, where disasters are continually happening, poverty is obviously increasing, there's economic issues on the other side, and we also, on the open data team, have weather data.
Huh. Yeah. Yeah.
We have a lot of weather model data,
Yeah.
which help predict weather and climate. That starts to get political quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to jump in here
Yeah.
as well. So I'm currently working with a company called Radiant Earth. It's trying to make some additional big sets of images available for free to NGOs and also give them a platform to do all this analysis in the cloud.
Oh, great.
So that may be forthcoming as well, in addition to the ones that you mentioned.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
Real revolution in satellite imagery. It's getting insane.
Yeah.
How accessible it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
I see the racial diversity and segregation and things like that, but I didn't see anything about religion discrimination.
Well, it might be the number of religions, what those religions are, what the core practices of those religions are. I mean, maybe.
So we did, for the global index under tolerance and inclusion, there's a number of indicators. Actually, under freedom and choice, we've got a freedom of religion indicator. I think probably, I would presume legislatively in the US, there wouldn't be much difference across states. Well, maybe there could be. And the second would be religious tolerance. And we use Gallup data for that may not be available at state level. But it's a good reminder. I think that kind of religious tolerance, religious freedom is one that certainly we've got in the global index that we'd want to reflect here as well. So do you want to come in?
Looking at the health and wellness, I just noticed there's, I guess, 6 bullet points that talk about physical health. And
Yeah.
I think beyond, like, there's a lot of opportunity beyond prevalence of depression
Yeah.
to go about reporting on mental health. I'm not exactly sure what data it would rely on, but like I said, I think just prevalence of depression is kind of shallow.
Yeah.
And additionally, I was thinking maybe count of like or measurement of prescription drugs could somehow be noted as well within health and wellness.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. On the mental health thing, I think people are talking about over the next 20 years, mental health is going to account for 50% of disability. So, and it's just hard to measure, and especially if you try not to avoid medication data. But certainly that's one we'd love to measure better, is our mental health. The other one we haven't got that I'd love to measure better is not prevalence of disability, but quality of life of living with a disability. And I think this is critically linked to the whole aging debate, is if more of us are going to be living lives that have disability or fragility as part of that life, it's not a negative indicator if we see rates of disability and fragility rise. The question is, are we building societies where people living with that can live good lives? And I have no idea how we measure it, but I think that's a really, really critical issue that we're going to need to measure. And I think is, what is a good society for an aging population?
What do you measure? Do you have, like I see there's no elderly poverty rates. I know you see you
Yeah.
can't cut it by age, but wouldn't that make sense to have since it's a vulnerable population and it touches on those issues, rates of poverty on the elderly, life conditions are on the elderly?
I think if we could do life conditions, that would be great. Income poverty would fall on our kind of no economic indicators. Then we generally see a very strong relationship between poverty and negative relation between poverty and social progress. But yeah, I think if there was some measure of quality of life for the elderly, that would be one that we'd love to include.
Can I ask a question about, it's really interesting to me that under personal rights you have perceptions of electoral integrity, and you also have election performance, which maybe includes a more objective measure of the same thing that's being perceived.
Yeah.
In personal safety, you know, there's not something similar to perceived crime rate.
Yeah.
In terms of just a social measure, I mean, is that something to think about? Why do you choose perception in some cases and not in others? Because in terms of social, I would, could imagine there might be a correlation between perceived crime rate and a reduction in tolerance and inclusion or something like that. Let me tell you something important about what's happening in society for the crime rates themselves.
That's a very good problem, because certainly on the global index we use perceived crime rate, and certainly for my country, the UK, we see a real disconnect between the perception of crime is much higher than the real level of crime, which is why I've always argued that closing down some of our hateful media like the Daily Mail would massively increase our social progress by stopping us being so terrified of crime. I didn't say that. So I think that's a good check. We should check to make sure we've looked for perception data, or should look harder for perception data, because that's absolutely right. I think there are two things: the reality you're living in, but also the way you feel about that reality. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, people can get quite negative when somebody present. They go, "Well, what's this survey data in there for? What about hard data?" But if survey data is reflecting people's real lived experience, that actually really matters. If I feel that is impinging on my quality of life. So that's valid data.
So much of the success of this is contingent on the data and the quality.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about how your team ensures you have such a high bar
Yeah.
for the standards of data you use?
Yeah. So we sort of, the way the pipeline works kind of is, first of all, does this data come from a trusted source? And so we're only looking at sort of respected organizations, whether it's state or private or non-profit sector. It's got to be someone trusted. Then secondly, we look at conceptual fit to make sure it fits right with the model and it's allocated in the right place. And then the third test we do is this principal component analysis, looking at the way the data fits together. And that will tell us whether or not, it helps us select indicators, because you may have two indicators that actually behave in exactly the same way. So they're actually collinear, so they're kind of redundant. So you might kick an indicator out. Or what we might do is then look at how we would weight the index. So each of the 12 components is equally weighted, but the indicators will weight using principal component analysis. And that helps us then fit together how we might weight perception data against outcome data. And then critically, it's about how do we build for each component a strong nest of indicators that are mutually supporting, that then give us a robust result, allowing for the fact that any individual indicator can be noisy in some places, but together they're stable enough to give a robust result. So it's very much we're in the zone of good enough, never in the zone of perfect. And as I remind people, I sometimes go around and talk to people, they talk as if GDP was handed down from God on tablets of stone thousands of years ago. It's a statistical tool invented just more than 80 years ago. It keeps getting revised how they measure it. Yeah, we keep recalculating our GDP figures. Yeah, people talk as if it's somehow the financial is real and the social is not. I'm sorry, pardon my French, but bullshit. Yeah, and it's one of those things we suffer from in the social sector is we haven't had enough investment of effort in gathering this kind of data and making it real. And that's part of our kind of effort, is about kind of data advocacy and how can we actually measure this stuff better, because it really matters. Because if we measure it, we manage it, and if we manage it, we'll get better outcomes. And that's what we want.
Any thoughts from anyone else on where to gather data? These are some of the things that we've talked about. Because that's kind of the key thing. I mean, obviously, Dave, there's a lot with the open data team that we need to connect. And then the other thing for you, I still haven't done the connection. Did I even do the connection to Zoom?
Yeah, we talked about
Okay,
it.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's an organization that does social media sentiment.
And then one of the issues we talked to them about is, only 4% of Twitter users are over the age of 46.
Oh my God.
So if we're trying to use that kind of social media data as a proxy indicator,
Yeah.
it's not really giving
not
us the texture.
inclusive,
So
yeah.
I think it's really been a really helpful
Yeah.
conversation, but it's one of the things we're struggling with.
Would technology usage and access to technology be an indicator since it's related to information?
Yeah, I think if we could, some sense, trying to get what's people's access
Yeah.
to information communications.
Yeah.
I should always emphasize, we did not just invent this overnight. We are standing on the shoulders of giants. There's a whole literature around this, particularly coming from Amartya Sen and Joe Stiglitz and others. So we very much built upon an existing literature. And one of the earliest foundational pieces is actually Adam Smith in his theory of moral sentiments. Talks about the idea of the aspects of a good society is the ability to be seen in public without feeling shame because you have a good suit of clothes. And I still think it's something we'd love to measure, since that's a kind of a measure of people's so there's still things we'd love to measure, and this is not new, these are old ideas, but it's actually finding the time when they're actually right and relevant.
It could be cool to look at the jury duty data
Yeah.
about like civil engagement with their,
Civil, yeah.
Yeah.
Data?
Yeah, that'll be interesting. Because one thing we'd love to look at once we've got the outcome data is then looking at the non-profit sector itself. One of the paradoxes is here is this country with this enormously thriving, innovative non-profit sector, and also these outcomes. Now, I was saying, what's driving that? What's the different patterns? Where are we seeing? Are there areas where the non-profit sector can really deliver and is doing so, but there are places where non-profits can't, where the state is failing or business is failing, and try and unpick those different roles and responsibilities? Because definitely I would say what is clear is each of these areas, the answer is not more government spending. Some of the solutions here are going to be in the way we run our businesses, the way we build our societies, the values that we spread amongst ourselves. It's not just about spending more money.
Have you looked at how people are spending their money?
Not yet.
What people spend money on?
Yeah.
I bet you could get trend data from that Mint website that people sometimes use. You know what I'm talking about? And it aggregates based on your credit card usage. It breaks down what you spend on what. I wonder if there's a de-identified way to engage that.
Well, one thought is, could you use that in two ways? One was, is there anything in that expenditure data that we could use as a proxy of something else we're trying to measure? Yeah. Could we find the fact that people are spending a certain percentage of their money on gasoline as something about a lack of infrastructure, or percentage of food as a representative of something else? That's one way. And then secondly is, could we then also map expenditure patterns against social progress outcomes and see whether there's some story there? There's kind of two ways. Yeah.
Spending on food and housing seems like that would give you indicators of the basic human needs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're spending a disproportionate amount of your income.
Yeah.
But I think even going the other way, spending things on frivolous could indicate higher satisfaction or higher flexibility. Because I think a lot of times, especially as middle upper class Americans, we tend to think oh, you have all this flexibility to do this. Maybe money buys happiness kind of idea there, but it's still that choice. You're not spending 50% of your income on housing. You're able to do all those extra things from
Or just track disposable income.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Got that.
What about people who are underrepresented by financial institutions that don't have access to checking accounts or stuff like that? How this would affect that and possibly skew that data, and if that in itself would be possibly a good measure, as far as how well people do, as far as if they're properly represented by financial institutions,
Yeah, that's when we actually looked at financial inclusion against our global data set, and we got no meaningful answer. But that's partly because trying to compare financial inclusion in Central African Republic, Pakistan, Colombia, and Sweden, there's no consistent measure there. But I think actually when we get to a more consistent, a national level 50-state index, then actually we can do that in a much more meaningful way. But maybe as an input indicator to look and see if there's a relationship with that. Because that's the one we'd be interested to stand up is financial inclusion one of our big levers to actually advance social progress?
Not a great case study there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Just through the mobile banking.
Yeah.
People are so many, millions of people are getting now just their first access. So if you could set a benchmark
Yeah.
and track that now, you get some good data. I'm sure that
Yeah.
banks have.
Okay, Michael, Missy, I think we need to take these great ideas and come up with two from each group.
Okay, cool, excellent. So we're going to win it. So on that point, so one of the great, I've shared so much pain already. Another pain for me is the fact we cannot take our global data set back historically. The data just doesn't exist, and that would be the really fun bit. Could we look at Kenya pre-M-Pesa, and do you see a significant change in social progress that way? So one of the things we want to think about doing is, can we separately build a historical social progress index data with a different data set? And then if we can build that, then we can look at the relationship between economic growth and other variables over time. And if we can then do that, we can get a better understanding of causation. And then if you can stand up the proposition that, this is why Michael Porter's in this with us, he fundamentally believes after 30 years of working on economic competitiveness, the long-term economic success is built on strong social foundations. And that societies that fail to invest in strong social foundations will struggle economically in the long term. And if that's true, then think about it. I mean, ultimately, if you are a society that's underinvesting in those areas, that is an economic risk you're building in. And that's something that then the bond market should be pricing in negatively. So if in a way you can create that connection between economic development and social progress, you can then create a positive feedback loop whereby almost the bond markets are disciplining societies to actually invest in social progress. And I was talking to some folks recently, talking about how the whole North Carolina toilet controversy is negatively impacting the bond price, because it's affecting property development because of inward investment, and that's having an economic feed through. And so if you can create that loop, that connection between the economic and the social, you're then hardwiring a positive incentive towards investing in social progress, and that's what we want to get to. Exactly. Right, so we've got to pick two things.
Yes.
I'm going to step back from this. So Lauren, you work with him to decide which two. So I think I might.
All right.
I'm going to be neutral.
So, let's see, what do we have here? We've got cyberbullying and social media data plus social media sentiment data analysis, marriage and divorce rates, hidden homelessness, Internet of Things user-generated data, access to financial services, political unrest, adding in political unrest, political stability. In personal rights, add diversity. Advanced education, add gender. Basic knowledge, also add gender. And we've also got access to public infrastructure indicators, and that data, that's probably where we have the most. We're looking at the Department of Transportation data, census data, and also the open data of our open data team. So geospatial data for OpenStreetMap, risk screening, environment indicators, and satellite imagery to look at deforestation and possibly even weather data affecting poverty and other types of issues like that. And then, in health, adding in mental health and prescription usage, quality of life living with a disability, quality of life for the elderly, and just generally breaking down by demographics. And then looking for perception data across all of these different categories, civil engagement data, and looking at people's spending patterns. So on all of those, as far as measuring social progress, what do you guys think would be most effective to augment this? All right. Well, it seems like the one where there's data there that can be looked at, and so I think this is a good one for what can be done right now. And then I think maybe the other idea we can pick is what would be best for the long term. Like, is IoT and user-generated data of the best next thing, or is it looking at social media sentiment and how people feel, but not necessarily applying the IoT technology to it?
One more includes than the other. I think maybe the social media could become more people in terms of data.
No.
That's what I would think, is that social media sentiment data to be able to map to, where is it?
We're ready.
Okay, great.
Cool.
We are almost ready. Because perception across all categories of social media data might actually be, you could get perception from the social media data.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, you reporting back?
Yeah, sure.
Excellent. I'm going on stage. I'm going on stage. Let me go and take the stage. There's my microphone. Oh, look, what a great technical team. They could sense. They must have had one of those sensor things. They could see I was walking up steps and switch my microphone automatically. Wow, you're good at AWS. You're good. Right. Well, look, I was with Group 1. They were fantastic. Group 2, you've got a tough time. This group was fantastic. Thank you all so much. Lauren, you kindly agreed to feedback.
Happy to do it. So we picked two ideas based on what could be, where's data now that can be used to feed these indicators, and then one for the future on how to gather data to possibly look at new or supporting indicators. So for currently, we talked about, number one, getting access to public infrastructure data, as well as geospatial data and satellite imagery. And that can help look at things like how much public access to public infrastructure do people have, how far are they from a hospital, which can affect their ability to get access to healthcare, and perhaps even weather data, all of which are housed as part of our open data team, that could look at if there's hurricanes happening in an area, lots of natural disasters, that's going to have a ripple effect to poverty, people's access to public infrastructure, it's going to wipe that out, and all of that kind of good stuff. So adding in kind of some of these other maybe uncommon data sources for looking at personal or basic human needs, but possibly could be kind of supporting data for all of these indicators. And then the second thing was, in some of these indicators, you'll see that they're talking about perceptions of things and perceptions of electoral integrity. And we were thinking, well, what if you did perception data across all of the indicators to understand there's the data and then there's how people actually feel, for example, in the case of crime rates. So I guess in London or in England, the perception is that there's an awful lot of crime when there actually is not. But that affects your personal well-being if you're constantly scared because you think there's a lot of crime and if there is not. So the idea was, how would you get that perception data? And the thought was, if you could do social media sentiment analysis as these kinds of issues crop up, then maybe you could actually get that perception data to map to the indicator itself.
Cool. Thank you very much. We want anyone to comment, edit, add to? No.
So did you pick two?
Those were the two.
Those are the two. Okay, yeah.
We had many, many more. Many, many more. We were really good. Ladan, over to you.
Okay, so we had a great conversation with so many ideas. We're going to try to resolve two. The challenge was about a platform that would work in making this data that is collected in the index actionable for different stakeholders. So we came up with.
Oops, sorry.
Can you hear me? I'll try to speak a little bit.
It's on now. It's on now.
Oh, it's on now. Okay. So the two ideas. Ooh, that's. The two ideas we thought we selected are the first one is to have a platform that have different personas. So the consumers or the stakeholders of the data, if it's a public citizen versus a researcher versus a state or local government. So the platform needs to think of different techniques and ways to really communicate. For a public citizen, it could be visualization and interactive map. For a social scientist, it might be an API so they can get the data and maybe do more analysis. For state and local, it could be something that has a little bit micro simulation and provides kind of a what-if scenario if things change in terms of investing in this area versus the other. So that was the first idea, is to have a platform that accommodates different stakeholders. The second one was to really build a data exchange, hopefully maybe on Amazon, AWS. And that data exchange will be the matchmaking, or the data matching exchange, which is a place where the different stakeholders could exchange the data that is available, and the role of also a mediator, somebody who could really translate this data into actionable and analysis, so it will mean something. So I look at this as a part of an ecosystem for a data matchmaking platform. So these were the two ideas.
Cool, thank you. Well done, Group 2. Anyone in Group 2 want to add any comments to what we've heard? So we have 4 ideas: the data exchange, the multi-persona platform, social media sentiment analysis, and then the kind of geospatial space. That's right? Those are our 4 ideas. Why do you think, before we vote on which is the winner, you could have a winner, rankings matter, those come first. Let me say a few words about where we are on the kind of process while you're thinking. So we're in the process of developing this framework, building it. I think in 15th of September in DC, we're going to be having a workshop where we're trying to bring in stakeholders to help us continue this process. So thank you for your contribution so far. If you want to join us, if you've got people you think should want to join us, we'd love to hear from you. And then we'd love to also stay in touch as we build this out, using people like you, people who are engaged, who care, have got a lot of expertise to test out these ideas as this grows. We'd really love it. The 50-state index will just be the beginning. We really want to build this out across really granular levels, breaking out, if we can, in those different demographic ways, really improving this. So having a community of people who are both committed and expert is really important to us. So we'd love to stay in touch. Cool. The vote. So, and there's a bias here on which order I do it in, and peer pressure. So let's do it in reverse order. Who votes for the data exchange as the #1 idea? Who's going to do? Can you tally the votes, Art? Since you're neutral.
Yeah, electoral integrity might not be here if I'm doing it.
Okay. Then the multi-persona platform. Only vote once. You want that one? Social media sentiment. Votes for social media sentiment. Okay, and then the geospatial data. Little forest of hands. A little bit of bipartisanship, that's the spirit we want. Yeah?
It's geospatial data for the win.
Is it?
Yeah.
Geospatial data for the win. Congratulations. And we didn't tell you this, we didn't want to bias the results. I think there's a small prize for the winning team.
The winning team, if you guys want to put your emails in my phone, we'll be sending you on gift.
Group 1, congratulations. Group 2, I'm sorry, it was so close. It was so close. Ladan, before we close, any final words? Ladan is SBI's Global Network Director. She is leading this work in the US. She is the person who does all the work. Ladan, any final thoughts before we close?
It takes a village to do this, and in this case, it's going to take a whole country. So please, if you could share with me your business cards, we want to stay in touch with you. We want you to be part of our arsenal that activates as our activation partners as we roll this out. So thank you for your contributions, and this is just the beginning. We're going to continue to make you work, and we promise to make it worth your time.
Cool. Thank you all so much.